Thank you, everybody, for joining. I hope for the next hour will be a productive use of your time. Good morning again. My name is Mike Conroy. I'm the director of the Data2Sustain European Digital Innovation Hub. I'll explain that in a few minutes and the consortium and the group behind that and who we're working with. I'm joined by my colleagues, Seamus, Mark, and Brian, who I'll introduce in a few minutes. The objective this morning is really three things. I'll briefly introduce the new European Digital Innovation Hub called Data2Sustain that's active in the west and northwest of Ireland, and kind of put it in a national context, in a European context, in terms of how to kind of support the SME community in its broadest sense, and I'll define that shortly. The second thing is, hopefully, as you're joining a webinar called Cyber Resilience, you will find over the next 40 minutes listening to some experts and interacting with them through the chat. You'll get something valuable for your business and in terms of the direction. And finally, we'll launch an upcoming series of workshops and company-specific consultancy services that are available through the European Digital Innovation Hub for free through various criteria, and I'll introduce that at the end and how you connect with that. So with that, I'll move on to the next slide. So just to introduce Data2Sustain. Data2Sustain overall. By the way, I should also say there will be an opportunity to ask questions during the session. There will be an open chat, so feel free to do that. We will also be running a very short poll to kind of pick up some data points that will be useful for the team and perhaps for the group discussion at the end. And I'll also have a signpost that's very specifically, it's called out during the session, but also at the end as to how you register for services or how to engage with me and the team over the next coming weeks if you're interested. So specifically, Data2Sustain is part of a European Digital Innovation Head structure. It was launched by the minister in October. It's one of 4 nationally that were launched. Data2Sustain focuses primarily on the west, northwest, and border counties, but will engage with companies throughout the island in partnership with the other European Digital Innovation Hubs, specifically Factory Exchange, which focuses on Industry 5.0, and the Cedar AI Centre. So as you can see, it's a diverse consortium, primarily from a service delivery perspective, made up of newly hired people as part of the hub, but also fully supported by all of the capacity within the Atlantic Technology University and its 7 campuses throughout the region, and the University of Galway. And we'll get into some more of that specifics, and also the embedded innovation gateways and other aspects of the of both universities. We're doing this in partnership. I'll speak about the consortium a little bit more on the next slide. We're doing this in conjunction with Cyber Ireland, which is the national cluster organization, under Owen Byrne, which is doing a fantastic job working with the ecosystem of companies, academia, and public policy. It's also in partnership with regional skills groups in the West and Northwest, and with the Innovation Technology Atlantic Gateway, which has over 200 members, SMEs and multinationals, and a great resource. All of those organizations are great resources to join, to be part of the wider community. I'll speak for another 1 or 2 minutes, and then I'll be handing off to Seamus Dowling, Mark Frayne, and Brian Mulhern, my colleagues, to get into the nitty-gritty of the seminar. In terms of Data2Sustain, in terms of leave you with really a couple of messages. One, it's consortium. It's very focused. It's pre-funded, so the services are passed on under open access and de minimis to qualifying SMEs and PSOs, which is pretty straightforward, can move very quickly, and can focus in many sectors that's enabled by the digitalization and transformation that everybody is under pressure to move through. Services fit into those 5 areas there, 5 areas described there. So innovation projects, access and brokered expertise, skills and capacity, which is really what we're talking about here, and also the business supports in collaboration with the agencies, specifically the LEOs, the UDROSs, WestBIC, Western Development Commission, and NWRA. All are part of the consortium and funded to provide services as a unit. My second last slide. It's a broad base, obviously. So if you're an SME or a participant on the call, was interested in following up on any of these matters, feel free to get in touch through the website or through me, and we will engage to see how we can help you specifically in the near term, but certainly over the next year. Just to introduce the webinar from a contextual perspective. It's very much in the public mind, and I'm sure on the business mind, in terms of the sophistication of and scale of attacks that are happening. The percentages around the number of ransomwares that's paid, the payment diversion fraud that's taking place, the phishing attacks are extremely high in the 50 to 70% across the SME community. So we'll take you through that and the threat vectors caused by a combination of remote working, and many other aspects of the multi-channel experience that across all businesses. We'll deep dive a little bit into the governance and directives in terms of what's emerging on the legislative front, and particularly around governance, particularly around the directives coming in October of this year called NIS2. That's something to be very aware of for any business dealing with the public sector, or in fact any critical supplier value chain. And we'll focus on 3 or 4 areas, try to balance and focus in on how you balance evolving your skills and leadership around people, process, and technology to put in place the priority resources and actions against the risk profile that you've got. Where can we help with organization skills and capability? It's not about selling new technologies, but appropriate management of existing systems in many cases. And then obviously having the defense of business continuity actions in your organization at a leadership level. So with that, thank you again. A very brief introduction to Data2Sustain. Look forward to working with anybody who wants to choose to follow up. And we'll hand over now to Seamus, Mark, and Brian. Feel free to ask any questions on the chat. We'll answer some as we go, but we'll have a dedicated session at the end. There'll also be a brief poll. And so with that, over to Seamus. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike, and great to see everybody here. I recognize some of the names. I suppose as academics here in ATU, we're used to seeing how our students and our graduates and our alumni contribute to the IT services in the region, and also nationally and internationally. So it's great to be able to kind of work with Data2Sustain and the delivery of the service directly to and speak directly to the SMEs themselves. So I'm going to just flick through, just talk about how this webinar is going to work, and it's very much about signposting to the activities and the action items associated with the workshops. It's not a boring lecture series, but it's very much about these are the action items. This is what we can do for you as part of Data2Sustain. It's very much about cyber resilience. It's very much about building up your cyber hygiene and ensuring that the proper defenses are in place and that you have a proper plan in place in the event of something happening. So we like to think that we're going to take a structured approach to cyber resilience. So myself, Mark, and Brian, when we sat down, we started designing the service around the delivery of cyber resilience. We felt that it was very important that we broke it into 3 thematic areas. So you see down the left-hand side of the slide that I'm looking at, we are going to talk about secure architectures and practices and best practices with industry. We're going to talk about data security, forensics, and threat management. And we're going to talk about governance, risk, and compliance. And all the while, I just want to reiterate, this talk is very much about signposting the activities associated with the webinar and the next steps associated with that. So, these are real actionable items that the Data2Sustain service can contribute to your organization's cyber resilience. So there's a couple of questions I'm going to ask right from the get-go, and I suppose these are important to kind of set the context for why you are here. Up at the very top of this slide, you can see I just put up a slide that says cyber defense is good. So we're all used to our antiviruses and our firewalls and our backups and whatever else we're having in our organization. But cyber resilience is better. So in the event of a cyber attack, how do we actually respond to that? How do we ensure that our business is able to continue, that it's not catastrophic? And so building in that resilience in peacetime, when we're able to plan and implement the policies, will mean that in the event of a breach or a cyber attack, we have those policies in place and we're able to be resilient. So a number of questions I'm going to ask. First of all is, why are you here? And you can see, and I have 5 points on that one, is maybe you just want to consider how you're going to build resilience into your organization. And that's really critical in the area of governance and compliance. Maybe you want to kind of create a culture of cybersecurity in your organization. So the second question I'm asking is, what is your role? Cybersecurity culture is not the responsibility of you, be it an IT person, be it a nominee, be it the office administrator, be it the owner of the organization. Cyber resilience and the cyber culture in your organization is a responsibility for everyone. You want to be able to understand where you are. So the third point there is the baseline checklist. So you need to understand what assets you've got, be that IT systems, be that data services, be that human. And then in the event of a major catastrophic breach, how does your organization keep going? So the business continuity is really important. How would your organization survive a cyber attack? So this is where my colleague Brian will be talking about the governance and risk and compliance. It's really important. And I suppose one of the really critical things, and it's very relevant to a lot of legislation coming down from Europe, such as NIS2 and DORA, is if you're part, the fifth point there is, if you're part of a supply or value chain, then you are critical to the overall infrastructure as well. And the second question I'm asking is, what is your role? And cybersecurity is a responsibility for everybody, not irrespective of whether you're the owner, IT staff, chief operational officer, line managers, end users. Everyone plays the role of cybersecurity resilience in the organization. And I suppose before I go on to the next question is, does size matter? There's a survey there that we're going to pop into the chat with you. I think Anya is going to pop that survey, a link to the survey into the chat, which is really important. This survey will help us gauge how we take the next step forward with the workshops, how the webinar, how the advisory sessions will play out. So understanding, so you see the survey is just popped into the chat. So understanding where you are as an SME for us is really important. And it'll really help us plan what the next steps as regards the workshops and the advisory sessions are. So the SME size, we have what's called IG 1, 2, and 3. And IG 1, 2, and 3 in cybersecurity is called an implementation group. So some of you might identify immediately with IG1, implementation group 1, which is that you're you have limited IT and cybersecurity expertise to dedicate towards protecting your assets in your organization. That might be you as an office administrator or an owner. It might be you who's just responsible for running the IT on a day-to-day basis, firefighting issues that take place. IG2, the implementation group 2, might be you have dedicated IT staff in your organization, individuals responsible for managing and protecting your IT or cloud infrastructure. So, I recognize some of the names here, as I said, so I know that you're dedicated IT personnel. The third implementation group is you have dedicated security experts and expertise that specialize in different facets of cybersecurity. And so this allows us to categorize how big your SME is. Some of you will identify with implementation group 1, some of you will implement with IG2, and some of you will identify with IG3. Irrespective of whether you're any of these categories, we think we have a set of actionable items that are important for everyone. And we can tailor those during the workshops and the advisory sessions as well. So this is the questionnaire that's just been popped in there. As I mentioned, it's quite generic. We just want to know your role, what sector you're in, the size of your organization, the basic cyber defenses that you might have in place that you know about, if you have dedicated IT personnel, and then what service areas along these thematic areas to look at maybe governance and compliance, secure architecture, and data security and monitoring. Or you might decide that you were interested in all of the above, and hopefully over the next couple of minutes, we'll get through those 3 thematic areas and you'll have a better idea. So the left-hand side here, you see we have some kind of a structured approach to cybersecurity. So a lot of SMEs will try and take a la carte sections of cybersecurity, put in some firewalls, do some data backups, maybe put in antivirus, maybe they protect the end devices. But in the event of something major, catastrophic failure or happening, it's how we respond to that, how we build in that resilience. And so there are tried and tested 5 steps and it's linked to a framework, which I'll talk about in a minute. But if you can identify your critical assets, that includes people, data, and your systems, you are then in a position to be able to protect them. You can identify how you protect those. You then detect any type of anomalies or malicious activity in your network. So that's the detect section. How you respond is very much about the policies that you have in place and how you have planned for a cyber attack. And then how you recover is you learn, and it's an iterative process, and you plan in peacetime. So I make the point that the planning phase, we do that in peacetime. So that's associated with identifying and protecting when we have time to be able to do that. And then we can do the monitoring during the detection phase, and then we're in a position to be able to respond and recover. And the next slide is going to be important because I see how these 5 will actually link into an established framework that we know nationally or internationally. Before I get on to that, I just think this is a really important report at the bottom of this slide, where I have the Hiscox Cyber Readiness Report. And this is an international report that questions thousands of companies, SME companies internationally, and asks the questions of the impact of a cyber attack. And you can see that some of the statistics are quite startling. So the first one there is cause the breach for third-party partners. Because you're all part of a supply chain, or probably part of a supply chain, a quarter of respondents said that it caused the breach for third parties. It had a negative impact on brand or reputation. Another quarter of respondents said that. Reduction in business performance, or the solvency or viability of the business was threatened. There was greater difficulty attracting new customers, they lost customers, or there was a fine or penalty that had significant impact on the business. They are quite stark statistics associated with what potentially could happen as regards a cyber attack. I think that last one underneath is really, really important, that Ireland stands out this year with having 7 in 10 firms targeted, which is a third more than average of the study group, which is an international study group. Now, there could be various reasons for that. It could be a geopolitical reasons. There's precedence for that, where one country will actually launch a cyber attack. It could be the fact that we're being exploited because of particular vulnerabilities within an area or a region. It could be that. It could be economic factors. But for some reason, if Ireland is experiencing an uptick in cyber attacks, that affects everyone. It's not just the big players, but it also affects every organization, including SMEs that are attached to anything got to do with that. So this concept of identifying, protecting, detecting, responding, or recover is important for the next slide. So some of you might be familiar, if you're in the IT area, of something called the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. This is an established framework, and it's the structured approach that we're talking about implementing cyber resilience. If you're able to identify your critical infrastructure, you identify those threats and vulnerabilities, we can then look at how we actually protect those. And once we're able to protect those, we can, we can look at the vulnerabilities and we can try and patch those vulnerabilities. We can then look at how we detect, and you're probably doing that already if you have some kind of antivirus, firewalls, for example, you're continuously monitoring. And then the last two, the respond and recover. And this is very much about the governance and risk and the compliance element, about what plans you have in place and policies you have in place to be able to implement this. So irrespective of whether you're the implementation group from the previous survey, whether you're IG 1, 2, or 3, you will definitely find practices and actionable items that will be relevant to you across all of these 5 of identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. So as I said, that's an international recognized framework. However, in the real world, if you're implementing any type of IT infrastructure, these are a technical checklist. And this is from a really great document from the Regional Skills Forum, which is be available soon. And, at a minimum, you're going to have something like you're going to have some kind of user access and firewalls and maybe antivirus 1, 2, and 3. So that is your normal password management, that kind of stuff. You're probably going to have maybe 5 or 6. And maybe you might have 9. As a minimum, that's what you want. You want to have anything down the left-hand side you probably need as a minimum. And then you need to look at how we can build in resilience by looking at the training, facilitating remote workers, secure networks, building in incident response plans through governance, encryption, and data protection. So this is a really good technical checklist, and these are the topics and these are the points that we will be working with you as part of actionable items. This is my last slide, I think. So before we move on, so what actionable items can we provide? So based on that framework, these 1 to 6, irrespective of the SME size that you are, these are the actionable items that we'll be working with you with. So the very first thing is you need to be able to understand where you are. So 1 and 2 is where are you right now regarding your cybersecurity. So you need to assess your current cybersecurity maturity, and we will work with you through that as part of the workshops. You need to be able to assess, number 2, assess, prioritize implementation of security controls. Mark Frayne will talk about that in a little bit more detail to protect the assets. So the assets, again, are your software, your data, your IT systems, but also critically your people as well, because they can be targets of phishing and spear phishing. And, you know, all of us have been guilty of clicking on that text or clicking on the link in a text or in an email. We've all done it. So irrespective of whether you think you're cyber aware, we're all vulnerable. The second 3 and 4 is very much once you have identified in 1 and 2 where you are, we can then look about how we can mitigate and reduce your vulnerabilities associated with that. So in the workshops, we will look at what your critical assets are, and we will use various frameworks and various tools that we can actually look at mitigating what known attack vectors may exist out there on your systems. So, for example, the tools might be the MITRE ATT&CK framework for those of you who know that, and maybe anything from any type of data capture, from logs to firewalls, and up to larger entities then, such as SIEM systems, for example. And then the 5th and 6th bullet point or 5 and 6 is very much about how we implement the governance, how we plan and how we respond, and how we continuously try and improve the resilience in our organization. And we need to, so Brian is going to talk, and this is what the workshop items would be as well. We would look about how you start implementing that governance within your organization and what action items are required for implementing compliance, because as we mentioned earlier on, there will be some legislation coming down the track that ensures, that means if you're a third-party supplier or you're in a part of a supply chain, that these legislative articles will apply to you as well. So we will revisit these at the end of the webinar. So after giving a bit of a talk about each one of these, we'll come back and we'll talk a little bit more about these. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Mark Frayne, my colleague, who will talk a little bit more about secure architectures and best practices.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Seamus. Thanks for the introduction. As I said, I'm a lecturer with Seamus here in ATU Mayo in cybersecurity. The team that we're following, the section I'm going to discuss with you today is around security architecture and best practices. It can maybe be a daunting challenge for organizations to try and encompass everything that is part of this security architecture. But I think if there is a process to that, which Seamus mentioned earlier, around identification and protection, that can help organizations and it can help businesses on a roadmap, on a journey to improving your security architecture overall. So just going to take a few minutes and maybe run through some of those points with you this morning. So as I said, we're hopefully going to link in our security architecture and best practices into a series of workshops. And those workshops are all going to be concerned with trying to establish where your cybersecurity maturity or your baseline is at present. I think that's important in terms of then being able to determine where you go in terms of actionable items around improving those cybersecurity defenses. So that's something we will examine, as I said, later in our workshops. So if we start with our introduction to cybersecurity architecture, what is it? What does it encompass? Well, it's the process of identifying, designing, building and operating secure systems. So that can be vast. It can be a vast system that you may be dealing with. It may not be. It may be a single broadband router that you have in the corner, or it may encompass any number of virtual servers, virtual service providers, to provide your security architecture. I think it's important nowadays that we note that how data processing has evolved in the last number of years. That's really important. The traditional approach was data set behind a locked environment. It was behind your firewall. It was in a secure network, and it was locked down, and only authenticated personnel had access to that. Now data is everywhere, and it's accessed everywhere, and it's processed everywhere. And your security architecture needs to be able to adapt to that. It needs to be able to respond to how people want to work, how they want to live, and do this in a way that it doesn't put your organization or your business at risk. So that's what we want to look at around appropriate technologies, trying to identify as part of this process those technologies that work for you as a business, as an organization. I think the challenge for us and for you too as an organization is around identifying those actionable items or those technologies that align with what you do as a business. And that's why we would be hopefully getting you to work through. Our goal would be to try to identify those assets that are critical to you as an organization. Now that's going to vary. That, you know, if you're smaller, if you go back to, as Seamus mentioned earlier, the 3 IG1, IG2 and IG3 implementation groups, those assets and those critical structures may vary across those implementation groups. But if we can identify those for you, regardless of where you fit in that implementation group, we're then able to better align those with your business goals and then start to identify appropriate controls and technologies that can protect that information. So again, we're aligning this here with the NIST approach, maybe with those 5 key points around identify, protect, detect, recover, and respond. You may ask, well, what are controls? Why do we talk about security and security controls? Well, controls enable us to identify safeguards that can then help us improve or better our security posture or our security architecture. I think what we want to try and do is then identify, well, what are the appropriate cybersecurity controls that fit with your organization and with your particular needs. If we look at one of the industry recommendations here is from the Center for Internet Security, CIS, and their benchmarks identify the best practices that can lead the way towards improving your cyber defenses. And this has come from a wide range of industry experts. They've engaged with security professionals from across the globe, which gives a more holistic view of cybersecurity and cybersecurity guidance. With particular reference maybe to CIS. CIS identifies a particular set of controls, depending on version 7 or version 8, that your organization can follow in order to be able to improve its security posture. When we talk about assessing your security infrastructure, we're going to look at workshops and advisory sessions. I think one of the key things that Seamus mentioned earlier is about this notion of trying to identify maybe where you are in that journey. So it's about trying to identify a baseline that can include actionable items, that there are flags for you as an organization to consider then, well, okay, we need to deal with these and we need to look at how we can improve on our security posture by working on these actionable items. They may form the basis of something like you may want to do an asset register. You may want to identify maybe all of the data assets that you have within your organization. And as part of that process, you may then decide, okay, I'm going to classify that information as well. And from there, then you should be able to, okay, I know what information I have. I know how critical it is to the organization. We can then put in place an appropriate policy around access to that information. So who has access to what information within our organization? We're probably doing that already, thanks to GDPR. But if you're not, you probably should be considering to putting in those appropriate access control structures. And one of the things we've seen more recently is the move to another security architecture commonly referred to as something like zero trust, where we have least privilege access guaranteed on all our endpoints to ensure that we don't have data leakage. Unfortunately, data can move to wherever it's allowed move to. So we need to ensure we put in place the controls to prevent that. So our workshops are going to try and examine those topics. We're going to explore the resources and try and identify those actionable items that relate to you as a business or an organization. And from there then look at ways that we can improve that security architecture and security posture maybe going forward. We will align, as Seamus mentioned, to some of the technologies that were part of that cybersecurity roadmap document. So I believe that may be published in the coming weeks, but we will also identify other technologies that are relevant to your organization. So that's maybe the next one is just a snapshot of those workshops. They're the type of goals we want to achieve in that consultancy approach. And hopefully there's something there that has maybe caught your attention that, yes, I want to go in, I want to identify critical assets, I want to identify appropriate access controls, I want to look at appropriate security technologies, encryption, data protection that work for my organization. Okay, I think that covers my section. I think I might pass back maybe to Seamus. You're muted, Seamus. Sorry.
Seamus, you're muted.
Yeah, okay. My apologies, I better go back. So yeah, I'm going to move on following on from Mark. Thanks, Mark. And looking at the thematic area, as I mentioned, of data security, forensics, and threat management, and very much again, I want to align it with maybe the action items that we would work on within the workshops or advisory sessions with you in the next number of months. So again, following on this structured framework, as I mentioned earlier on, so it's an established NIST cybersecurity framework, and very much this concept of data security, forensics, and threat management, this thematic area would cover the three middle sections within the framework. So Mark very much talked about the identify and protect. So I'm overlapping a little bit on that on the protect, detect, and respond area. And again, these are actionable items that every SME needs to consider. So you need to be able to once you've kind of identified those critical assets and established that the baseline for where you are vis-a-vis cybersecurity maturity, you then need to be able to identify, reduce, and mitigate the vulnerabilities in those assets. So if those assets are people, then you need to be able to look at how we can implement more security with your end devices or your end users. That might be as simple as some kind of a training program. But it also might look at how we can patch servers or how we can fix the vulnerabilities that might exist. And this is kind of important as well if for a lot of organizations and SMEs that might have older systems in place. They might have a production line that is controlled by a particular server that's not part of an overall network. It might be a closed loop network. And then for some reason, you might decide that you want to attach it to the larger network. And these just expose a whole new raft of vulnerabilities. So once you identify those critical infrastructures or those critical assets, we need to look at all the possibilities associated with mitigating any vulnerabilities that might exist. Being proactive to detect, then being proactive is where you monitor, capture, and examine data for what's called indicators of compromise. So every cybersecurity attack or every breach that takes place or has taken place or potentially could take place, the cyber attacks and the malware will leave breadcrumbs behind. And those breadcrumbs are hidden, they're not even hidden, they're available in your antivirus log files, in your firewall log files, and in server data and stuff. And more often than not, we don't even look at that. And sometimes we get fatigued even with our antivirus with some kind of a message or a red flag popping up on our antivirus or our endpoint saying, captured and quarantined another virus. This could all be indicators of something else going on. And so I would like to kind of talk as part of a workshop item. I would like to say, let's consider what potential indicators of compromise might be associated with maybe your log files and your data. Because if we can identify that something is vulnerable and we can identify that it's continuously and it's recurring, then we can very quickly patch that or remove that vulnerability from our organization. So there are all these small little quick wins that we're looking for. And that's being more proactive. So you can see in brackets there that I would like to kind of consider that we'd be more proactive at that phase. And then in the area of responding, so if a breach takes place or when a breach takes place, we can't go run around and throw our hands up and say, what do we do? What do we do? We need to be in a position where we have a proper set of activities. So develop and implement appropriate activities to act regarding a detected cyber incident. So very much around what Brian Monhard will talk about around the area of governance. If we have proper policies in place, we need to know, okay, this happens, you need to disconnect, or you need to shut the machine down, you need to call somebody else, we need to quarantine. You know, there's loads of proper processes and procedures in place. So that's all about responding. And if I move on to the next slide, you know, these are the actionable items. So it's all well and good looking at a framework, but these are the things we would consider as part of workshops and advisories. So if you're looking at this and you don't know what the MITRE ATT&CK framework is, then just do a quick Google of it. And MITRE ATT&CK stands for Adversary Tactics, Techniques, and Common Knowledge. So it's a huge repository of known malware, threat groups, nation states, all their tactics, techniques, all the ransomware, all the malware that's out there, and how we mitigate against those vulnerabilities. I mean, it's a huge repository, and we can use the framework for a defensive gap analysis. So you can check, let's say you have a new production line that you want to bring online and you want to connect to your organization's network. We can check if there's known vulnerabilities or attack vectors associated with maybe servers or technology that you might be using. And we need to be able to kind of identify and mitigate against those. So determine if solutions are in place to detect or protect against them. So you might realize that we need to upgrade our server, or you need to put in some kind of a patch, but we can't just kind of randomly do that either, because that could have implications for your organization as well. So it's all well and good saying we need to mitigate against a particular vulnerability, but that might stop other processes of valid or critical processes in your organization. And we'll have to kind of look at that. There's lots of pen testing tools that we can show you and point towards just to check various vulnerabilities. It could be simple as just doing a scan of your network activity to see if there's anything anomalous in there. As I mentioned, vulnerability, point 3, vulnerability and patch management may be required. Certainly if you have older systems or other new connected systems, as I talked about, some kind of production line in place, before you just start rolling out all these patches and assessing these vulnerabilities, you want to make sure it doesn't have a negative impact on the actual functioning within your organization. So that's actually quite important as well. Number 4 is all these indicators of compromise can point to an ongoing breach or a past breach or future breach, or can indicate that something is about to take place. And your systems generate lots of interesting log files. And more often than not, we don't even look at them. You know, we just assume that that red flag is just benign and we're not going to examine it, or we have loads of log files coming from our firewall. We don't really understand why the lights on the router are flashing really quickly, you know, because they could all be pointing to something. So it's very simple to kind of implement policies that you just do a quick search or a sweep for this. So the number 5 is kind of interesting because you probably already are on this journey already. So detection and protections could be as simple as antivirus and firewalls. So you might have already those as a minimum. And somebody asked the question in the chat, and I punched in that at a minimum, SMEs need antivirus, firewalls, data backups, and some kind of secure access through good password management. That's a given, and you can build upon that. So you can go on to the next one, such as more complex, such as what's called endpoint protection and detection and response. And that might be simple. That could cost maybe 30 or 40 or 50 euros per end station. For example, it could be semantic, and they could be just running continuously, monitoring and detecting and quarantining of end devices. So these are all options that we will discuss during workshops and advisories. Or we can look at it, even if you're on the larger side of an SME, we could look at maybe more complex systems, such as SIEM systems, such as there are larger systems out there that allow you to capture all the log files and collate them all together. It's not for everybody, and if you're a small SME, this won't be for you, but certainly if you're on the larger end of an SME, this is probably something that's for consideration. And there are also dedicated threat hunting tools from all the big players that are out there that they're easily installed, and they can do an immediate sweep of your organization just to kind of look for those indicators of compromise. So all these actionable items that I have up here on the top would be some of the topics that we would discuss in workshops. We would look, very much it depends upon what you would have done in the first phase with Mark, such as identifying those critical assets and how we can work on those. Just a kind of reiteration of that, how all those actionable items actually fit into the detect, detect, and respond phase. So very much protection is all about how we might look at the MITRE ATT&CK framework. We'll do vulnerability assessments based on that, on your organization's assets. We look at some pen testing options or vulnerability and patch managing and testing. So all about trying to protect the infrastructure as is, what you've got at the moment, and identifying what vulnerabilities might be associated with that. And then we look at how we can monitor under the detect phase, how we can monitor and look at the tools associated with that. And then the respond phase is how we can look at developing appropriate activities, as I mentioned. So you're talking about how do you respond to the likes of quarantined items or flags that are raised on endpoint protection and detection. This is just a very quick little example. For at the moment, there's a trending piece of ransomware called Black Cat. And Black Cat is just a variant of another ransomware that had very high efficacy rate. So that's what happens with malware. If it is proven to be very effective, then variants come out that use the same tactics. So in the MITRE ATT&CK, for example, we're able to see everything about that Black Cat. So it's a huge repository. We're able to look at every piece of malware that's out there, and we can look at every piece of mitigation associated with that. So even in that second slide at the bottom there, I have highlighted mitigations. It tells you exactly what you need to do on the server, what button to click, what option button to click. And it's just by closing off this loop or this hole or this vulnerability, it can have a huge, massive impact on the overall resilience of your organization towards that. And I suppose it's a larger line at the end, which is the HSE. We all know it's become the benchmark for cyber attacks, the HSE cyber attack. But the PricewaterhouseCoopers report, one of the big ticket items, one of the big findings it had was that there was no effective patching program in any of the systems. So you were dealing with older systems that hadn't been upgraded or updated, etc. So patching and vulnerabilities and vulnerability management is a huge thing within any organization. And so finally then, before I pass it on, under this thematic area, the workshops are there. We look at using the MITRE ATT&CK framework on your critical infrastructure. We would look at how we would mitigate against those vulnerabilities, and then we'd examine some of the tools, and we'd look at maybe the live monitoring and capturing of your data in a little bit more detail. And following on from that, then we would take that to another maybe one-to-one session. We would kind of sit down in a little bit more detail and examine your captured logs, for example, for indicators of compromise, and we would look at rolling out other tools such as EDR, SIEM, and maybe threat hunting tools as well. So this is all under the area of that actionable items associated with data security, forensics, and threat management. And with that, I'm going to pass you on to Brian Mulhern.
Sorry, I'm muted. Yeah, thanks, Seamus. I think I have control of that at the moment. And Mark and Mike for your introductions there and your previous talk, and good to be able to talk to you all today. So my piece is on governance, risk and compliance, specifically around governance, because governance, covers the whole remit of activities that Mark and Seamus have been discussing so far. So in terms of workshops, then we would look, a little bit deeper around governance frameworks, and in terms of the one-to-one consultancy, then we might, talk specifically to companies about their particular situation and, how you would start to implement a governance framework in your particular organization. So governance then, why is it there? I suppose I couldn't talk about governance without referring to the current media situation that's there with our largest media provider and the problems they're having with governance. Won't say any more about it. I can't comment on whether it's right or wrong, but it just shows you, why governance is such an important thing around this. I suppose early IT governance stemmed from the fact that maybe 20 years ago, rise of the internet, etc., that people were throwing money at technology and seemingly not getting a payback out of the technology that they were setting up in their organizations. So organizations like Asaka and Axelos says, well, we need to examine this because a lot of money is lost around this. And what's the problem here? And of course, the problem was that the technology wasn't being aligned with the business goals, the business objectives in the organization. There was no proper evaluation of the technology around that, with the result that the technology actually wasn't fit for purpose. It was just been bought because it was the latest thing out there. We have to have this and it's going to make money for us. So the governance of information technology started out as I suppose a scientific process from that. And organizations like Asaka, as I said, which came up with the COBIT framework around that, and Axelos, partnership with the UK government, developed the Information Technology Infrastructure Library, which created a governance structure or a governance framework around that. So what do these things do? They create a connect between the technology goals and your business goals. It's termed alignment. So your technology is aligned with what your specific strategic goals are in your business. As these models, COBIT, ITIL, and there are others, have evolved, they have evolved to take into account the fact that technology suffers from cybersecurity problems. So they need to build cybersecurity elements into those overall governance framework. They also put a focus, it says there, on outsourcing arrangements. So, a lot of our technology today is provided by third parties, provided by cloud providers. It's managed by third-party IT providers, and I suppose when it comes down to it, a lot of our IT resource is an outsourced resource. So again, later iterations of these governance frameworks have put a focus on those outsourcing arrangements, making sure you have proper service level agreements in place around those, so that they can cater for that element of your IT. And finally, they help with compliance because, as Mark and Seamus have pointed to, there are a lot of regulations at the moment around IT and the way IT is handled. Different types of organizations have different compliances that they have to adhere to. I suppose all organizations have to adhere to the GDPR that we're all familiar with. So compliance is a big thing then, and how do we do that? So what governance gives you is the overall picture on this. What does this whole thing fit into? It gives us a basis for decision making around decisions we take. And the lads have talked about the identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Each of those things can happen at different levels. What drives the decision making around our approach to cybersecurity? Do we go all out, with the sledgehammer approach and get the max antivirus we have out there, the most expensive antivirus? Or, how do we grade our approach to cybersecurity in the same way that earlier organizations didn't grade their approach to buying technology into the organization? We now should grade our approach to the adoption of cybersecurity controls into our organization. At the max, you see, those cybersecurity controls, if you apply them at their max level in the wrong way, they can really restrict your ability to do business. So there is a graded approach to how you apply those things. So yeah, big picture of governance. I put this slide here just to show you, all the various elements that exist, within a governance, within a cybersecurity approach. And, you have things like application of controls, you have encryption, you have, your threat hunting, your mitigations, etc. All of that form part of a cybersecurity approach. But what is your overall thing that governs how you implement that? What are the steps you would take in trying to implement that, given the type of organization you are, given the size of your organization, given the focus, the business objectives of your organization? How do you decide what to do around this? So what's your decision-making process? And again, I suppose referring back to the governance question that's in the media today, governance is about the decision-making processes that you employ in, adopting various levels of cybersecurity protections. You see, you've got stakeholders in this. You may have shareholders in your business. You've got your employees. So you've got to be very careful that you balance your approach to cybersecurity with the needs and wants of the other stakeholders in your business. And this is what the governance framework gives you. So it's about how do you create an approach around implementing cybersecurity. And in terms of compliance, then, we talked about, or it's been mentioned a few times, what does compliance mean in organizations? And, straight away, when people think of compliance, they think of the point number 3 there, the rules and regulations that you have to adhere to externally. But actually, in order to get people to comply, you've got to make sure that your ability to do that internal in your organization is very much thought out and thought through. And one of the best ways of ensuring compliance inside in your organization is a motivated organization. Are your people motivated around this? Have you managed to create a culture around cybersecurity within your organization that doesn't mean you heavily rely on point number 2, which is, deterrence in place, fear of penalty, fear of the possibility of being caught, fear probability of penalty being administered. They have to be there, but they have to be there in the background. The much better thing is to create that culture. I think in the past, an analogy has been drawn with building sites maybe 20 years ago that had a very poor culture in terms of health and safety. And the approach was, well, somebody gets hurt, well, we have the first aid kit here in the corner in the dusty mobile office on site, and that was our health and safety. But if you look at the change in culture today, you can see, the high vis, the hard hats, the toe cap boots, everybody needing training, so everything from an angle grinder up to the large cat dozers, everybody needs a ticket, everybody is trained in that respect. So we're talking about a change in culture around cybersecurity, and that's the reason that as Mike said at the beginning there, that's why we're here today. We're trying to initiate that culture change, but there are specific approaches, specific steps in terms of adopting that culture, and that's really where the whole governance approach comes in. Again, in terms of the workshops, we would look at the specific compliances that are there. So around GDPR for everybody, payment card industry data security standard. If you're handling card transactions as part of your business, you have to adhere to this standard. NIS2 has been mentioned, the latest EU directive. And by the way, the points in that directive align very much with the identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover elements that are that have been talked about here previously today. And again, those elements, they come directly from the cybersecurity framework, which was the US initiative by President Obama, came in around 2015, mandated for operators of essential services in the US. So the EU is following up with this, so that essential services are not negatively impacted for a long time, that they get back up and running very, very quickly. And that's what resilience is about, that you get back up and running very quickly after an attack. DORA, which is the digital organizational Resilience Act, specifically focused on financial services. So again, you know, financial organizations, large financial organizations that may suffer a cyber attack. The idea is that this doesn't impact the economy around, particularly the EU, because this is flowing out from the EU. And SOC 1 and SOC 2 are systems and organizational controls. Again, these are flowing from the US, and these aren't regulatory compliances as such, but these things are very much part of the, let's say, the marketing of particularly third-party organizations that handle personal data or indeed financial data. So organizations handling personal data, for example, would say we are SOC 2 compliant, and organizations handling financial data need the SOC 1 compliance if they want to market that as a level of security they have. And large organizations, assurance organizations like PwC, like Mazars, would be the people that would write the SOC 1 and SOC 2 compliances following an audit within your organization. So we can look at some of the things that you would need to have around this. The NIST 2 there, as Seamus said earlier, where do small organizations fit into this? Because it doesn't actually mandate anything for small organizations, but the SMEs and the micro organizations fit into this through the supply chain element. As part of NIST 2, operators of essential services are mandated to manage the cyber security of their supply chains, and of course that's where a lot of the smaller organizations fit into. So, you know, very important that you take cognizance of that. Overall, then, you see, governance fits into every part. The identifying roles and responsibilities. Who's going to do this within the organization? Identifying your business processes. Identifying the systems that align with those major business processes and the information flow around those systems. So, if you're looking for a decision as to why you did something, your governance around that is that you are aligning it with your major business processes. I mean, Seamus's report there, the Hiscox report, showed that all of those, each 25% layer, hit back on an impact on the business of cybersecurity. I mean, that was it. So your starting point then is, how do we align cybersecurity with our business processes? In terms of protect, you see, you again need a priority for protecting. You know, what are your high impact systems? What are your medium impact systems? What are your low impact systems? How are they aligned with your major business processes? So your governance process then will give you some way of prioritizing them. Excuse me, those. In terms of detection, you know, well, that's really in the antivirus data analytics side. But again, you know, it means, like, how do you align that antivirus? Where do you put the strongest parts of your antivirus? What's the decision around that, or who's going to do that? Whose role is it to do that within the organization? In terms of response, it's very, very big, because when you get a major cybersecurity hit, what do you do? What is your policy around switching off the systems? You know, how do you contain it? What is your policy around containment? How do you set up a communications channel? Or what communications do you use if you take all of your email offline, for example? How do you communicate with the rest of your organization? So your governance system will ensure that there is a policy around that. And the final thing about recovery then, how do you bring your systems back online again once you have identified the hits, once you have responded to it in terms of containment? And by the way, the other thing I should mention there is, how do you report an incident? Who do you report it to? You know, not sure if people are familiar with the National Cybersecurity Centre, and they being the first line of support for reporting cyber incidents. And, you know, those things need to be reported, even from the smallest ones up. So recovery then, how do you get back online? And you see, that is resilience, getting back as quickly as possible. How do we recover from that? So my workshops and my one-to-ones then would, you know, focus on those things. The workshops around the cybersecurity framework, maybe looking at the ISO 27001, which is one of the big risk frameworks that's out there, and then looking specifically at the compliances as it relates to individual industry. So, taking a particular industry, what is your background? What do you do? What are your priorities? What are your major business objectives? What systems align with that? And then building up a cybersecurity approach from that overall thing. So I think that's in a nutshell where I say I can go with that. I think apologies, I may have gone over time a little bit. Thank you. You're muted, Mike, again.
I made the same mistake. Hi, it's Mike again. Thanks, Brian and Mark and Seamus. So we're going to sort of move to summarize and to wrap up. So just before we do that, Seamus will sort of do a quick summary on the sort of workshops and activities. There's been some really good questions on the chat. So if you've got a few minutes, certainly pop in some more. We'll get into that in a minute. Also, just a reminder that there's been quite a lot of response to the forum link that was put online. Please pop that in there. It's really helpful to follow up. And there's a couple of comments in the profile that will bring up the questions. So let me pass over to Seamus for just a quick summary of the structure again, and then we'll come back and I'll talk about next steps, how you sort of engage, who we're working with, and answer some of the questions.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I suppose one of the slides I put up and I talked about at the beginning was maybe the actionable items. And so I mentioned that I would revisit these. So now that myself and Mark and Brian have kind of talked about the thematic areas associated with cyber resilience for SMEs, I just wanted to revisit these again and based very much on the survey that you're completed or you're currently completing that we put up there regarding maybe the company, the status of your company, the demographics of your company, and where you are regarding cybersecurity and maturity. I would like to just kind of revisit these 6 points again, these actionable items. Now, each of us, myself, Mark and Brian, went into much more specifics as opposed to the exact tasks or goals we would have within each of the workshops or advisory sessions. But overall, I think it's important to kind of revisit these because 1 and 2 there, the points under secure architecture best practices, 1 and 2 is very much about assessing where you are and using that as a baseline, and then trying to figure out where you want to kind of get to. And 3 and 4 is very much about how we can help your organization get to that point where you're improving your cyber hygiene, you're developing your cybersecurity maturity, and you're becoming more secure and defensive against and more hostile against cyber attacks that may take place. And 5 and 6, as Brian was talking about there, that's all well and good, but if we have some kind of a structure in place, or you have some kind of a policy structure, and you have a governance that dictates the cybersecurity culture right throughout the organization, and if those policies and that governance is in place, then we think that's really, really important to implement that. So 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all very tangible, practical antivirus, firewalls, cybersecurity tasks that we can implement. But 5 and 6 are very important to build that culture within an organization. And I suppose we'd be very excited at the task and the point of actually going to sitting down in workshops with SMEs and trying to build that culture into an organization and try and raise that cybersecurity maturity right throughout the process of the workshops and the advisories. Leave it up to you, Mike.
Okay, thanks, Seamus. And again, thanks, guys. So just wanted to move to questions and answers and just do signposting to next thing. So first of all, straight up, really excited to be working with this group. As you can kind of gather just from what we sort of touched at a high level, and we went deep in some places and came up. So it's a really fantastic leadership team. The Data2Sustain digital innovation structure sort of allows us to put funds into free up people to work with companies and to bring in also dedicated staff, and then sort of signpost that on to, as I said earlier, many, many different services, sort of combining things that might exist across internal and external, just signposting people to the really relevant training classes and then bringing them back into a bit of advisory consultancy so they can really make use of that. And so we're sort of joining things up and then actually potentially go to individual innovation or research projects. So the next steps before we get to Q&A is there's a website I mentioned at the start. I just posted in the chat. So www.data2sustain.ie. If you go on there, you'll find out more about Data2Sustain. You'll be able to click into services. About 22 services in there. We'll be adding those as we go, and also working very closely with the other digital innovation hubs. You can also, if unclear, and that's always quite possible because when you get into the conversations with companies, it's not bespoke. It's never really bespoke regarding a particular service or opportunity. And this Data2Sustain and the EDH is about brokerage and a conversation and as I work with companies over the last 4 or 5 months, it's about combining things and combining expertise. The expertise that's on this forum, but perhaps others, including external commercially. I've spent 38 years in the software industry outside of the structure of public and private, and so we're sort of used to working through that. So come in on info@data2sustain.ie. That'll come to the team or come to me, and we'll get back to you and be able to help. Specifically on the workshops, we'll be kicking those off with Seamus, Brian, and Mark in sort of March, probably around the 22nd of March. That's the launch date. We're working through, based on uptake, what that will look like in terms of follow-up. But think about both cluster and company group workshops plus offline advisories, both hybrid and face-to-face, as makes sense across the region. So we're going to get coverage, from let's call it the western region, south and up to the northwest and Sligo and into the borderlands. There will be opportunities for advisory and road mapping and generally taking that approach. There's a website there. You just pop in your basic details, and if you come in, I also want to emphasize, part of Data2Sustain is the agencies. So we're very much guided by what we hear from the LEO network. We're working very closely with the LEO leadership across the counties and their digital consultants, working with Uderos, working with Westbig, companies, agencies that represent traditional companies that are perhaps low on internal capability from a tech and cyber awareness perspective or governance, and then obviously tech companies who are in a different place. Also interested in working with the commercial IT services companies in partnership, because ultimately things have to get to implementation and get to some and we can help with some of that signposting. So looking forward to that, and then really helping to identify the priority actions and some of the things we talked about earlier in the call. So unless there's any final commentary maybe on this and again, a big shout out to Cyber Ireland's Regional Skills Group. We got Hilary McPartland on here on the call, and also Cyber Ireland represented, and Seamus mentioned earlier there's some fantastic assets coming, both at a visual level that we will use, that was referred to earlier. And this is very much a partnership, working together, not in a silo, but across these organizations, including ITAG, to get to as many companies as possible and to amplify and make the services available. So with that, I'll just jump to some questions. Let's Seamus, Brian, or Mark give any other closing comments on this engagement process. Again, check the chat to get the links or etc.